7 experienced wilderness survival experts were dropped into the extremely cold Arctic wilderness. In temperatures below -20 degrees Celsius, they had to build shelters, find food, and constantly guard against accidents. Relying on their extensive survival skills, the last one standing would win a $500,000 cash prize. The challenge took place within the Arctic Circle, where contestants arrived at their starting points by the show's seaplane. The first contestant, Sorens, became incredibly excited upon landing. Fortunately, a large boulder at the landing site served as a perfect wall for his shelter. The area, reeking of reindeer dung, hinted at abundant resources. Before the competition, Sorens was a professional blacksmith, crafting iron ornaments for museums and relying on blacksmithing for his livelihood. He joined the competition out of a deep love for the wilderness. After securing his shelter location, he began gathering materials to construct a sloped ramp against the rock wall, quickly fashioning a simple tent with a tarp and wooden poles. Notably, Sorens was the only contestant without a sleeping bag, relying instead on his muskox fur blanket to fend off the cold. The second contestant, Anders, discovered a natural shelter upon arrival. The spacious interior solved his shelter needs immediately. He laid his blanket inside, finding it perfectly sized, and positioned at the entrance was a clear view of the lake, ideal for monitoring any movement. Before the competition, Anders, with over a decade of jungle living experience, had amassed hundreds of thousands of followers on social media, sustaining himself with educational videos. To build a strong fire, he meticulously prepared wood shavings and, using a flint, successfully ignited tinder. He gathered pine resin to extend the burning time of his fire, reducing the need for frequent refueling. The third contestant, Bettina, couldn't help but cry as the boat departed, realizing she was now on her own. The lively fish in the surrounding lakes filled her with anticipation for the days ahead. Back in Norway, Bettina worked as an auto mechanic with a large garage full of custom cars, frequently customizing vehicles for clients. She was also a professional angler, often fishing in the sea with her private yacht. Bettina quickly packed her luggage and set up a simple shelter before heading to the lakeside with her specialized fishing rod. Notably, in this competition, contestants were allowed to bring a fishing rod and choose 3 additional pieces of equipment. Bettina brought a fish basket, intending to store live fish in the water to keep them fresh. Despite fishing for half an hour with bait, she caught nothing. Anne, the second female contestant this season, quickly set up camp upon arrival. After a short rest, she prepared to fish, hoping to rely on fish for survival. She brought various baits she had collected over more than 10 years, confident in catching both big and small fish. She quickly went to the lake with her equipment and immediately caught a barracuda on her first cast. She cleaned the fish on the spot, discarding the head. Klaus, the 5th contestant, had already solved his fire-making issue. While walking, he found many mushrooms that he deemed safe to eat based on their smell. Back in Denmark, Klaus ran an outdoor equipment store and had accumulated much wilderness experience from hunting and fishing alone. He entered the competition primarily to win the prize money to expand his store. However, as he was about to fish, a group of reindeer ran by on a distant hillside. Since they were protected by law, he decided to fish instead and quickly caught a small fish, making his dinner unexpectedly easy. The next day, Anne enjoyed a luxurious breakfast of fresh fish soup, while birds pecked at the fish heads she had discarded the day before. Meanwhile, Sorens explored his surroundings in the morning and decided to set up a gill net, hoping for a big meal the next day. He skipped breakfast and returned to camp to make tools. He crafted a handy hammer from a stick. He then attempted to build the roof's crossbeam. After measuring a large stone, he cut a sturdy log to serve as a support column for his shelter, cleaning off the bark. Despite pulling with ropes for a long time, the beam wouldn't budge. Frustrated, he had to move it little by little and finally succeeded in setting up the beam after 2.5 hours. Bettina was also building a shelter, using a nearby tree branch as a support. After setting up the crossbeam, she was so exhausted from a day and night without protein that she had no energy for anything else. She went back to the lake with her fishing rod early in the morning when the water was calm, hoping for a big catch. Soon, there was movement in the water, and sure enough, she pulled up a barracuda. The fish was quite large, enough to feed her for 2 or 3 days. Bettina used a net to keep it alive in the water. Anders, meanwhile, opted not to use a ready-made stone shelter, choosing instead to build a new one in the jungle. He cut several 4-meter-long sticks to start building, Constructing such a long crossbeam was challenging, and he fell several times throughout the half-day effort. Finally, he managed to prop up the frame, but it collapsed again while he was trying to secure it. On the other side, Klaus was building a simple triangular tent. This was his first attempt at such a structure, but luckily, due to the inherent stability of triangles, he easily propped up the frame and wrapped it with a waterproof cloth, planning to spend the coming days there. After setting everything up, Klaus went fishing. Like before, fish bit as soon as he cast his line. Based on the weight, this barracuda was quite large, the biggest he had ever caught, boosting his spirits. He brought it back to camp to hang in the tent, as he still had fish left from the previous day. After a simple half-hour cook over a large fire, he sat in front of the camp to enjoy his meal. On the third day, it was time for Sorens to check his gill net. He hoped for a good catch, but found the net tangled and empty when he pulled it ashore. Back at camp, untangling and restoring it to its original form was not an easy task. Over at Klaus's place, that day's task was to make a door for the tent. He measured the appropriate length with sticks, then made a frame to size and covered it with the versatile waterproof cloth. For breakfast, he chopped off the fish heads and stuffed the remaining flesh into a wooden hole, sealing the sides with bark to create an oven-like effect. In just half an hour, the deliciously cooked fish was ready, crispy on the outside and juicy on the inside. Meanwhile, Anders finally finished building his shelter. Given the cold weather in the area, he planned to build a fireplace outside. He turned around to start gathering stones from the surroundings. Along with soft moss, he quickly assembled it. Eager to see the results, he lit a fire, but did not consider wind direction. As soon as he lit the fire, thick smoke blew into the tent. After some thought, he dismantled it and chose a new location, spending another 2.5 hours. He thought it would go smoothly this time, but halfway through, the stones collapsed due to insufficient support. This deep frustration instantly made Anders lose confidence. On the fourth day, Ulrich, the sixth contestant this season, had been living in a simple tent because the ground was covered in edible blueberries. While he was drinking hot tea at the campsite, a crow suddenly flew past nearby. Ulrich tried to mimic the crow's call to attract it. Surprisingly, this tactic worked, and the crow flew towards him. However, it just flew over his head, not giving him a chance to use his bow and arrow. Back in Denmark, Ulrich was a professional hunter, skilled with the bow and arrow, often hunting large animals. He once nearly got counterattacked by a wild boar, which made him realize the dangers of wild animals. He joined the competition mainly for the prize money, but so far, he had not seen any small animals, so he spent time practicing his aim. The last contestant to appear was Meta, the only one with a compound bow. In the days before, she had to eat berries from the ground to stave off hunger. When she finally got a fish on the hook by the lake, it unfortunately escaped during the struggle. Before the competition, Meta was an archer with various animal specimens at home, indicating her skills. Besides, she was a jewelry maker. She joined the competition to test herself. After several days, Meta had solved her shelter issue. To make boiling water easier, she planned to go out to collect some sticks to make a frame. Back at the camp, she accidentally knocked over the iron pot while hammering the sticks into the ground, extinguishing the fire. Over at Klaus's place, he had been experiencing dizziness and a very fast heartbeat for several days, with no signs of it slowing down. Fearing damage to his health, he called the medical team. Soon, a doctor arrived quickly by speedboat. After a brief examination, the conclusion was that his symptoms were due to hunger. The doctor advised him to eat regularly, assuring him that it was nothing serious to worry about. Arriving at Sorens's place, today was another day to check the gill net. With previous experience in netting, this time he easily caught a large catfish. He cleaned the fish on the spot. Although the flesh didn't look very healthy, it didn't affect his cooking back at camp. He couldn't wait to eat, and soon devoured it in minutes. He then began to reinforce his temporary shelter to prevent the simple tent from being blown away by the wind. He had started building a permanent shelter days ago, the size of which was at least that of a mansion. Meanwhile, at Anders's side, he planned to make a kitchen for the camp. He placed a wooden stick between two large trees and used sawn wood slices as coasters. Even the iron pot could be conveniently hung up there, making it easy to arrange kitchen items on top. During a walk, he discovered a dry tree whose bark was rich in oils, easily ignited with a spark. He collected it, perfect for tinder in the winter. Afterwards, he went to the lake to check the gill net. However, as he pulled it up, it was cleaner than his face. Seeing no fish caught for 2 consecutive days, he decided to relocate the net. On the 5th day, Anne, who was fishing by the shore, suddenly spotted something exciting. A herd of reindeer had run up to her. They seemed completely unafraid of humans. Unfortunately, the competition rules prohibited hunting reindeer. Later, Anne returned to her old spot to check the gill net and successfully caught a large fish, boosting her meal before bedtime. She immediately started cooking back at camp. Unexpectedly, she found something hidden inside the fish. After cutting off the fish's head, she placed it directly by the fire to grill. Over at Bettina's place, after 5 days, she finally completed the frame and covered it with a waterproof cloth. Considering the roof was too flat, which could collect rainwater, she specifically elevated the middle with moss. As for lunch, she made do with some fish meat, thankful she hadn't eaten it all in one go. As night fell, Ulrich also nibbled on fish meat at the camp. Eating as much as possible was the only way to last longer here. On the 6th day, it was Ulrich's son's birthday. Thinking of his beloved little one, he, who was originally cooking fish meat in the morning, couldn't help but start to cry. Ulrich brought his equipment to the shore and took out the boat he had crafted. He had been improving the raft for several days, and today was the time to test it. He sat in the boat and rowed out. He intended to set up his gill net using thickets, but mishaps occurred frequently during the process. He had no choice but to return and refix the tripod. While setting up the gill net, one side of the boat suddenly started leaking. Before he could react, he flipped entirely into the water. Even the life ring around his neck popped open instantly. Fortunately, the lake was not very deep, and he soon climbed ashore, disheveled. Over at Bettina's, to sleep off the ground at night, she decided to build a single bed for the camp. She sawed several logs thicker than her thigh and moved them to the center of the tent. She then laid wooden sticks on top, covered them with spruce branches, and finished by placing a wool blanket on top. The bed was just the right size. Meanwhile, Anders, to reset the gill net, planned to connect several wooden sticks together for a larger netting area. He measured the distance with his steps and had brought a drill bit as his chosen tool, which was very useful for building shelters. He drilled a small hole, then connected 2 other sticks using mortise and tenon joints, and poked through the middle of the hole. He then used a stick to fix the 2 pieces together, creating a movable joint. He added many anchor points to the stick, brought the crafted stand to the lakeside, and gradually fixed the gill net to the anchor points. After placing all the sticks in the water, all he needed to do was wait quietly. Back at camp, he was very hungry, but his fish meat was already gone. To fill his stomach, Anders thought of using tree bark. He cut it into thin noodle-like strips, boiled them in a pot, and then grilled them on a pot lid. The taste was passable. Klaus had not eaten fish for 3 days. Today, he was back at his usual spot, fishing with a delicate lure. Standing by the lake, he began his long fishing session. But not half an hour in, the hook got stuck in a crevice. No matter how hard he pulled, it was no use. In the end, he had to cut the fishing line, losing not only the lure, but also a section of the hook and line. On day 7, Anders went to check the gill net he had set up. As soon as he arrived at the lake, he eagerly began to retrieve it. However, as he pulled it up, it felt lighter and lighter, and to his dismay, he found it empty and tangled around a stick. Not wanting to deal with the hassle, he cut it free with his knife. Disheartened by the failure of his painstaking efforts, Anders quickly lost confidence. It was uncertain how much longer he could hold out. At Soren's camp, he started his morning by pouring last night's wood ash into a pot, intending to make soap. He also picked some rosemary outside, crushed it, and added it to the pot. After just half an hour, a thick, murky liquid was ready, which he claimed was excellent for cleaning. He then stripped down and bathed in the cold river, which instantly invigorated him. Meanwhile, after 2.5 hours of effort, Bettina finally caught an old lake trout just before dark, relieving her hunger with some meat. However, a yacht suddenly appeared on the lake. It was medical staff coming for their regular checkup to ensure the contestants could continue competing. They reminded them that winter was approaching, and they needed to prepare for the cold. On the 8th day, Anders decided to shorten his shelter to conserve heat. He covered the roof with moss to protect against the cold. Klaus planned to make a small bed for himself. He chose a spot, cut some sticks, nailed them to the ground, and laid more sticks on top, finishing with a wool blanket. Sorens took a drill bit, one of the tools he had brought, and drilled a hole through the roof of his hut. He cut some wooden sticks to use as pegs to secure the structure, and covered the top layer with moss for rain protection. This task would keep him busy for 4 to 5 days. Meanwhile, Bettina also started building a fireplace but did not account for the wind direction, and soon, thick smoke swept through the camp, indicating a need for further improvements. By the 9th day, a disheartened Anders returned from another unsuccessful fishing trip. After contemplating for 2.5 hours at camp, he made the call to withdraw from the competition. As a yacht sped towards him, he expressed to the camera the immense pressure he felt, his discomfort in staying, and his longing for his wife and family. Packing up his belongings, Anders became the first contestant to leave the competition. Meanwhile, over at Klaus' camp, today was finally the day to check the gill net. He casually pulled it up and easily caught a fish. Soon after, he was back at camp enjoying the delicious meal. By day 9, Ulrich urgently needed to finish his permanent shelter. He simply laid a tarp over the frame to waterproof it. To fix a leak in the roof, he tied 2 sticks at the doorway and carefully climbed up, covering the top with a tarp as a makeshift cap to fend off rain and snow without blocking the smoke. He trimmed the excess material at the bottom of the tent to prevent the edges from fraying and briefly used a torch to singe them. He then moved all his equipment into his new home. Turning to Sorens, he washed his face after getting up and continued to reinforce his shelter. He had planned to build a luxury house at another location, but realized after several days of work that he lacked the strength. Reluctantly, he gave up on the luxury house and began to expand his temporary shelter. After working on an empty stomach all morning, Sorens decided to go fishing at the lake. Just as he finished speaking, his fishing hook showed signs of life. Surprisingly quickly, he reeled in the fish. Perhaps too hungry to endure, he did not fish for more and immediately returned to camp to process the fish. He started by pan-frying the roe from the fish's belly, and in less than 2 minutes, he ate everything. Over at Anne's place, she was one of the few contestants with a stockpile of food. For breakfast, she simply ate a fishtail. After breakfast, Anne decided to add a layer of insulation to her tent. Since the tent was too high and she had no ladder, she could only throw moss up bit by bit. She initially planned to rest at camp, but couldn't sleep due to the sub-zero temperatures. She then realized the importance of having a fireplace, so she went to the riverbank with her backpack to collect stones. She quickly built a fire pit with the stones, forming a circle. To avoid dense fog, she even made a skylight in the roof. As night fell, the inside of the tent finally warmed up a bit. By day 10, Klaus went back to his usual spot to fish with his rod. As the weather gradually cooled, the fish became scarce. He had gone several days without catching anything, despite changing baits multiple times. Frustrated, he focused on the gill net, which had been tangled since the last retrieval. Untangling them proved time-consuming and difficult, and success was uncertain. Unable to endure it any longer, Klaus simply cut the net with a knife. He then set the remaining half of the gill net by the lake, walking around it to ensure fish would enter. He hoped for a miracle the next day. Meanwhile, at Meda's camp, as one of the few archers, she took her compound bow up the mountain to hunt today. First, she mimicked a bird's call with a whistle and carefully observed her surroundings. Soon she felt dizzy and feared collapsing in the wilderness due to exhaustion. Deciding it was safer, she headed back to camp. Earlier, by the lake, she had found some reeds, rich in carbohydrates. Not wanting to waste them, she quickly cooked them in a pot. It was evening by the time she had a simple soup, but on the 11th day, Meti brewed a coffee-like drink from powdered birch mushrooms. After a warm drink, she went out hunting again with her bow but found little wildlife. Fortunately, she found plenty of wild berries on the ground, a far better option than going hungry. Over at Bettina's, being in the wild made her miss her family, prompting her to carve their names into a plank. After tidying up, she went fishing by the lake and soon caught an old trout. While retrieving it, she noticed birds eating her fish and started feeding them. At Ulrich's, as a top hunter, he constantly searched for protein but found not even a squirrel. After wandering with his gear, he reluctantly gathered berries to stave off hunger. Back at camp, hoping to rest, he found his shelter drafty and unbearably cold, forcing him to gather firewood. Being careful, Ulrich managed to chop the wood and then went to check his fish trap by the lake. Fortunately, he caught a 2.5-pound fish, but on the way back, His raft scraped a rock. He suspected it was damaged but had no time to fix it and decided to cook the fish instead. Meanwhile, Klaus at his camp was praying for a successful catch since it was his day to check the fish trap. At the lake, he carefully retrieved it from the water and, to his delight, finally caught some fish after 3 days. Too hungry to delay, he went straight back to camp to start cooking, grilling the fish over the fire. On day 12 at Soren's mansion, besides a warm and comfortable resting area, there was a roaring fire beside him with a ventilated skylight above, and even the cracks in the walls were fully stuffed. He then covered a tarp with sticks, pulling moss over it to prevent leaks. For breakfast, he gathered wild mushrooms nearby, which made a nice soup. He started gathering sticks around, a task that used to be simple, but now was very exhausting for him. His plan was to extend the shelter over the rocks. Over at Métis, she cooked a pot of reed roots in the morning, serving as both breakfast and lunch. Then she went fishing with her rod. Less than half an hour after casting, she quickly caught a small fish and headed home. The moment the soft fish meat hit her mouth, she felt completely satisfied, no longer having to eat grass to stave off hunger. Within 10 minutes, she had devoured all the fish. Meanwhile, Ulrich was also worried about food. Having focused on hunting these past days, he hadn't caught much fish. In desperation, he considered the idea of tree bark. He started to scrape it thinly with a small knife, the thinner the better for taste, and then cooked it for 2.5 hours. By the afternoon, he was enjoying his meal. The taste of the bark wasn't as good as expected, but it was enough to fill his stomach. However, while he was full and wandering by the shore, he suddenly noticed movement on his fishing rod. Worried it was a fish, he immediately started retrieving it. Sure enough, it was a small fish, which excited him greatly. He returned to camp, grilled the fish's tail, and saved the rest for the next day. At Klaus's place, seeing the water in the pot had frozen, he realized winter was approaching. Lacking a fireplace, he had to rely on a fire for warmth, which meant extinguishing it before sleeping each night. Despite the cold, he had food stores, allowing him to enjoy a good meal indoors today. Sorens, too, started eating bark. Due to daily intense activities, his body was burning through nutrients. So, he shaved the bark into thin strips, cooked them like noodles, and then hung them to dry on a rope. Construction of the mansion also never stopped. He used his own drill to make screw holes, then nailed the sticks directly, which was not only convenient, but stronger than using ropes. At Bettina's side, today was a special day for her. She made a white flag from bark and planted it outside her house. According to her, she had achieved her goal by coming here and there was no need to continue. Soon after, a yacht arrived. Without much discussion, she decided to withdraw from the competition. The main reason was the scarce amount of fish, which was completely unexpected. After packing her bags, Bettina contentedly went home. On day 14, Ulrich set out hunting with his bow and arrows. The morning temperature was close to 0. To catch the small birds nearby, he would go out every morning hoping for luck. He tried using a whistle to attract them, but after half an hour he saw no sign of them and couldn't bear the cold any longer. He had to return to camp empty-handed to warm up. At Meta's side, ice had already formed on her teacup in the morning, and the camp's ropes were as stiff as wire, showing how extreme the temperatures had been. Due to the recent cold, she did not go hunting but focused on building a fireplace instead. If she didn't manage this before winter, she wouldn't be able to withstand the cold. Megan planned to build the chimney outside the tent so that she could have a fire inside without the smoke. This required her to build a wall in the middle, a significant amount of work for her. It took her a whole day to build the wall, and the rest of the work was estimated to take another 3 to 5 days. Meanwhile, at Sorens's side, he had been busy building his wilderness mansion and had neglected protein acquisition. The high daily workload often pushed his body to the brink of collapse. To prevent boredom and missing his family, he spent his downtime doing crafts. Ulrich's shelter was probably the most rudimentary on the field, still just a piece of tarpaulin. With winter approaching, he needed to reinforce it. He began constructing a large door for the tent using wooden sticks. Once he had the basic frame, he covered it with the versatile tarpaulin. After finishing these tasks, he was very hungry. The continuous hunger drove him to the lakeside to fish, and he soon caught a small trout. Returning to camp, he didn't delay in chopping wood for a fire. Before long, he had a roaring fire and placed the prepared fish over it to grill. Half an hour later, he was enjoying the delicious, tender, and juicy fish, unable to stop eating bite after bite. On day 15, Klaus woke up early from hunger. The waters nearby were his usual fishing spot. On day 6, a mistake led to his bait getting stuck in a crevice. Knowing he had limited bait, losing one reduced his chances of success. He stripped and dove into the icy lake to retrieve it, shivering from the cold. Fortunately, he managed to find the bait after searching underwater and quickly returned to camp to organize his fishing gear. Klaus then went fishing with his rod but caught nothing after half a day. Reluctantly, he collected bark from the shore, not for food, but to store enough tinder for the winter. He also sawed plenty of firewood, ensuring he wouldn't need to go out in heavy snow. After 2.5 hours on an empty stomach, he successfully gathered a large bag of tinder and several bundles of firewood. Now he could wait at camp with peace of mind, settling for a few blueberries for dinner. Over at Anne's side, she tried fishing by the lake every day. Despite often returning empty-handed, it didn't affect her mood. However, when heavy snow started, she quickly began collecting sticks to reinforce her shelter, planning to cover all the tent walls. She worked all day without food or drink and successfully completed the task before dark. While walking around, she also found a skull. At Sorens's side, having not eaten for 2 days, he continued building his shelter, determined to finish the luxury shelter before winter. His body was extremely weak, and after a half day of work, he had to sit down to rest. Back at camp, he nailed a few nails inside so he could hang up the furniture, making it easier to take down. On day 16, Megan cut a plate of reeds early in the morning, having relied on them to stave off hunger for the past few days. She checked her fishing net to find it empty and returned to camp for a short rest. Unwilling to give up, she went to the lake to fish again, hungry for protein since it had been a week since she last ate fish. Surprisingly, the hook moved soon after she started. Hurrying to the shore, the catch grew heavier as she pulled. Just as she was about to finish with a stick, the fish she nearly had escaped unexpectedly. At this time, Sorens was busy mending his fishing net. Building a luxury shelter is no good without food. He then took his equipment to the lakeside to set up. He moved a stick and placed the gill net under the water. As usual, he decided to check on it the next day. While others were worried about fish, Ulrich had the luck of catching a big one. Upon cutting it open, the fresh fish meat was simply delicious. By day 17, before dawn, Ulrich was already out of bed. He planned to hunt small animals in the dark. Arriving at a hillside, he started to wait in position. Soon, a dark shadow ran by. Undoubtedly, a fox. However, before he could start shooting with his bow, the fox vanished without a trace. Despite trying to attract it with a whistle, he ended up losing track of it and had to return to the camp to warm up. Due to his negligence over the past few days, the boat he used for laying nets had unfortunately sprung a leak. To fix the hole in the boat, he took out the glue he carried with him. This tool, along with his bow and arrows, made up one piece of equipment. Thus, he effortlessly repaired the raft. Then, he took the boat to the lakeside, carefully navigating forward with the gill net, and successfully set it up in half an hour. On Anne's side, she picked up a large mushroom during her morning walk. Just as she was preparing to collect some firewood to cook, a yacht suddenly appeared on the lake. She thought it was a routine check, but instead, she was informed that the weather would get colder. For the safety of the contestants, the production team exceptionally gave each a fishing net. This was great news for Klaus, as his previous gill net was already ruined. Sorens was also excited. With this new fishing net, he could change locations and increase his chances of catching fish. Meanwhile, Megan was busy building a fireplace. The remaining task was to encircle a fire pit with stones and mud. Once a roaring fire was ignited, her 2.5-day task was finally complete, ensuring she no longer had to worry about freezing at the camp. The luckiest was still Anne. She had just set up 2 gill nets in the morning, and by afternoon, she had caught a big fish and a smaller one. She cut 2 large pieces of meat, put them in a pot to cook, and tasted them once they were done. Day 18 quickly arrived. Sorens, carrying a fishing rod, went to the lakeside to fish. Suddenly, a yacht appeared on the lake. The scene then switched to Sorens lying weakly at the camp. A doctor who arrived briefly assessed the situation. According to Sorens, he hadn't consumed protein for about 10 days, spending all his time building a shelter. He had almost fainted earlier and had called for help for safety reasons. After discussions, the medical team decided to withdraw Sorens from the competition to prevent potential organ failure due to starvation. Disappointed, Sorens reluctantly packed his belongings and left the competition, leaving only 4 contestants. Klaus, who hadn't eaten meat for several days, finally got lucky while fishing. He caught a small fish, cleaned it by the river, and directly enjoyed its roe as sashimi, which tasted sticky and quite good. By day 19, a blizzard swept through the competition area. Knowing his small tent would not withstand it, Klaus began to reinforce the walls against the strong wind, using ropes and branches to secure everything tightly before comfortably settling inside. The bitter cold forced him to stay inside the camp to rest. Meanwhile, Meta was filling gaps in her shelter. Since she didn't use the available moss, she used snow to encircle the fireplace. Back at camp, she took out a thermometer to check her temperature. Her priority was to quickly start a fire for warmth. Since she hadn't stored enough tinder, starting a fire became a hassle. Desperate, she used a sanitary pad provided by the show's crew. Its soft material quickly produced sparks, allowing her to successfully light the fireplace. However, with no cover over the fireplace, the heavy snow soon extinguished the fire, leaving her no choice but to sit and endure the cold at camp. At the same time, Anne was also resting at the campsite. To pass the time, she began to mend her torn socks with fishing line. She was grateful for the walls she had built earlier, which now protected her from freezing. Ulrich, appearing calm, went outside to check his spike net at the lakeside. Carefully checking, he found the net as clean as his face. Still hopeful, he checked the fishing hooks he had set up. From a distance, he saw the float sink, but found only a clump of waterweed when he pulled it up. When he returned to camp, he found many footprints on the ground, likely left by foxes. However, hunting in this weather was not feasible. He could only return to strengthen his tent. After that, he mostly rested at the camp until day 20, when the weather finally cleared. Klaus removed the ropes from his shelter and noticed he had lost a lot of weight when he put on his pants. Not wanting to be disqualified for being underweight, he knew he had to find some protein. He took out his cherished fishing hook and went to the lakeside with his rod to try his luck. After casting his line many times, he successfully landed a fish. Though not large, he took it back to camp to cook, grilling it over the fire. The fish was crispy on the outside and tender inside. Ulrich, who also planned to fish, had the advantage of a boat, allowing him to drop his spike net deeper than others. With high hopes, he pulled the net ashore, feeling it get heavier as he lifted. He first caught a small trout and then a larger one, totaling 5 protein-rich catches, along with a few small fish caught in previous days. Ulrich now had 9 sources of protein and enjoyed a delicious meal back at camp. Over at Met's place, she woke up feeling a slight improvement in her cold symptoms. She quickly started a fire in the fireplace for warmth. After a brief rest, hunger drove her to the lakeside to fish, but she returned empty-handed again. By day 21, Ulrich, shivering in his tent, decided to build a simple fireplace to alleviate the cold. He dug a large pit in the ground and a trench outside for air ventilation, covering it with wood. Once lit, the fire significantly warmed the shelter. He quickly began to test his creation, and the fire was much stronger than anticipated. His lunch was simply a grilled fish. Meta, facing a failed fireplace build at her camp, decided to make a fire pit inside. She collected a large pile of stones to surround the head of her bed for the campfire, and to avoid smoke, she specially made a skylight. With the fire blazing, she felt an unprecedented warmth and saw that the smoke was venting well, finally allowing her to rest comfortably in the camp. If one were to judge the most comfortable shelter in the competition, it would have to be Anne's, with excellent wind and thermal insulation. Day 22 quickly arrived. While the other contestants were still asleep, Klaus was already fishing with his rod. He soon caught an old trout and continued fishing due to the lack of food. Surprisingly, he caught another big fish after casting twice more. In just half an hour, he secured 2 sources of protein, which thrilled him. He then took the fish back to camp. Meanwhile, Anne started her day by cleaning. She found a puddle of liquid at the entrance of her shelter, left by some animal. Given her skills, hunting was not an option in this cold weather, so she decided to stay in camp and do crafts. The most comfortable contestant had to be Ulrich, who slept until noon. Upon waking, he went to his stored fish, took a small one from under the plastic cover, and returned to his tent to enjoy his meal. In contrast, Meta's situation was not good. She had not replenished her protein for a week, causing her great physical pain. Looking at a photograph of her family, her tears continuously flowed. Suddenly, a yacht appeared on the lake. The scene shifted to Mete, who had been waiting on shore for a long time. According to her, the lack of a campfire had made the cold unbearable, and she decided to withdraw from the competition due to the lack of food. After packing her belongings, Meta left the competition regretfully, leaving only 3 contestants. Day 23 arrived, and Anne began collecting firewood relentlessly to prepare for the coming winter. Unable to withstand the cold, she made a bowl of oatmeal, but she knew it wouldn't last long. She needed to find protein to survive. Meanwhile, Klaus resumed his fishing, aiming not to return empty-handed. On the other hand, Ulrich didn't worry about food and started building a single bed to avoid sleeping directly on the cold ground. By day 24, clear weather excited Anne, who had been contemplating new survival strategies. Fishing with a net in such cold weather was impossible, so she decided to build a raft using waterproof material and branches, and then crafted a paddle from more branches. After preparing, Anne cautiously launched into the water. To her surprise, the raft was quite buoyant. She immediately started setting up a spike net without delay. At this time, Ulrich had already set out in his boat. Unfortunately, today's spike netting yielded nothing, which made him instantly anxious. If the food stored at home ran out, he didn't know what to do next. Just then, another yacht sped towards him. It turned out to be a distress call made by Klaus, who had suffered from kidney stones before and had been experiencing persistent pain around his stomach for a few days. For safety, he decided to have a doctor check him out. After a discussion, the doctors felt surgery was unnecessary, and he could continue in the competition. On day 25, a squirrel suddenly appeared in front of Ulrich. It looked plump and tempting, but it was too far away for him to use his bow. Before he could even aim, the squirrel had vanished. While Ulrich was observing from his spot, he spotted a partridge standing motionless nearby. Unfortunately, he couldn't shoot, because any slight movement would startle the bird. Reluctantly, Ulrich returned to camp. After spending the morning in the cold, his hands were frozen. He quickly lit a campfire to warm up. Just then, there was a noise outside the camp. Looking out, he saw a group of wild reindeer. Sadly, the competition rules did not allow him to hunt them. Watching the reindeer slowly disappear, Ulrich couldn't help but swallow his saliva. Meanwhile, Klaus warmed himself by a fire outside his door in the morning. After preparing, he went to the lakeside to fish. He avoided using a spike net, finding it too cumbersome to set up. He preferred spending all his time on fishing with a rod rather than wading into the cold lake to lay nets. This resulted in a very low chance of catching fish. He waited from morning until afternoon, but no fish took the bait. It seemed he could not escape hunger that day. Over at Anne's side, it was finally the day to check the spike net. Eager, she quickly took her boat to the center of the lake. As the net was gradually hauled ashore, she easily caught 2 small fish. While resting on the shore after cutting the trout for storage in the snow, another yacht quickly approached. It was the show's crew delivering mid-competition equipment. Considering the upcoming colder weather and the lake soon freezing over, they thoughtfully provided an ice auger and safety gear for falling into the lake, along with bait to attract fish. Meanwhile, Ulrich was also preparing his fish. For him, securing protein was effortlessly achieved. Day 27 has arrived. Klaus planned to go ice fishing on the lake today and made thorough preparations beforehand with all equipment ready. He decided to first try out the smaller lakes nearby. The lake surfaces were solidly frozen, but one must be cautious outdoors. For safety, Klaus wore a life jacket and even tied a rope around himself. He first drilled a hole near the shore to ensure the ice was thick enough to support his weight before moving to the center of the lake. He then started fishing aimlessly from the shore. Meanwhile, Ulrich also packed his gear, including an ice auger, and headed towards the lake. Unlike Klaus, he went directly to the center of the lake without fearing falling in. He quickly drilled a small hole in the ice to avoid staying in one place too long, which could lead to hypothermia. He lit a campfire nearby and began fishing by the fire. However, it seemed there were no fish in the area, or perhaps their luck was just bad. After waiting for half the day, neither had any catch. Ulrich even lost his bait accidentally. Eventually, both returned empty-handed. Anne was the most sensible among them. Even though the crew provided ice fishing equipment, she found ice fishing too challenging. Instead of sitting out in the cold, she preferred to stay at camp and tidy up the spike nets, which were quicker than fishing. By day 28, the crew came for a routine medical checkup. All 3 participants were in good health, except Klaus felt some itching in his toes. The doctor diagnosed it as a fungal infection, not frostbite, and advised keeping his toes dry for recovery. Afterwards, he returned to shore fishing and finally decided to set up spike nets around for a better chance of success. By day 29, Ulrich began to collect his second spike net. As he unfolded the net, thoughts of his family suddenly overwhelmed him. He wished his wife and son were with him. After a moment to calm his emotions, he continued in his boat to check the nets. The first haul brought in a 7-pound barracuda and several small fish, perfectly positioning the net. After collecting all the fish, he returned to camp with a catch of 7 to 8 fish, securing his food supply for the next half-month. At Anne's side, since the spike nets yielded no catch, she had to take her gear to ice fish on the lake. Fearing that she might fall through the ice, she tested its thickness with a stone first. Then she carefully made her way to the center of the lake and drilled a small hole with an ice auger. However, after being busy for half an hour, no fish bit the bait. It seemed like another day of wasted effort. Klaus's plan was to visit the mountain to remember his father. He brought along his father's photo and ashes. With his gear on his back, he headed to the mountaintop, started a campfire, and after a simple prayer, scattered the ashes into the sky. He said this helped calm his mind, allowing him to focus on the competition. After the prayer, he felt spiritually elevated. On day 30, Klaus planned to build a raft necessary for fishing in deeper waters. He quickly assembled a wooden frame and used his backpack as a flotation device. However, the raft began to sink almost as soon as he sat on it. Despite his efforts, it kept sinking and ultimately failed after several tests. Over at Ulrich's side today, checking the spike nets again, yielded a large catch of fish. He returned to shore with a full load, adding to the fish he caught in previous days. Ulrich had now achieved complete fish meat independence. Given his stockpile, winning seemed certain. Anne planned to retrieve the fish meat she stored yesterday. However, after digging through the snow for a long time, she couldn't find any trace of it. It was definitely stolen by nearby animals. By day 32, Klaus finally had a change of luck. Starving for a week, he was thrilled to find a large catfish in his spike net. Too hungry to wait, he went straight back to camp to cook. With the fresh grilled fish ready, he eagerly replenished his energy. Meanwhile, Ulrich was also cooking fish at camp, enjoying his dinner without worrying about depleting his supplies. By day 34, Klaus took out fish heads he hadn't eaten in the first half of the month and put them in a pot to make soup. While waiting, he didn't sit idle but went to the shore to cast a few lines, hoping to catch a big fish. Meanwhile, Anne came to check her spike nets. The good news was that she finally caught 2 fish at once. However, she wasn't excited this time, but started to ponder the meaning of staying here. Day 36. The environment was already covered in snow, and even the lake at the door had frozen over. This was not good news for Ulrich, as he still needed to check the spike nets by boat. Fortunately, the ice was not very thick, and he could still row on it. Luckily, he caught a fish. Back at camp, he found he still had 7 or 8 pieces of fish meat. He was tired of eating the same thing every day and wanted to catch different prey. Having not used his bow and arrow for a while, he practiced at the door. Over at Klaus's side, early in the morning, he quickly packed his gear and decided to go to the hillside behind to clear his mind. He felt almost crazy staying in the tent all day and found breathing fresh air outside to be useful. However, on his way back, he felt severe pain in his heel, not sure if it was frostbite or an injury. Back at camp, he immediately called for help. The doctor arrived quickly, checked the injury, and concluded it was tendon inflammation. He just needed to rest for a few days. After discussing, they suggested Klaus wait a few more days to see. Then they started collecting firewood nearby. Meanwhile, Anne was at the lake collecting water. Instead of returning to camp to boil water for cooking, she melted the discarded fish heads and guts on the shore to feed the birds. Without having breakfast, she started sawing wood nearby but soon felt dizzy and weak. If she couldn't catch any fish soon, she was close to withdrawing from the competition. Day 37. The temperature reached -10 degrees. Anne was still waiting for the lake to freeze enough to ice fish, but the thickness was still not sufficient. Day 38. Ulrich's side of the lake was solidly frozen, making the raft unusable. He removed the tarpaulin from it. While busy, thoughts of his family overwhelmed him again, and Ulrich shed tears of longing. To boost morale, he returned to camp and quickly built an outdoor kitchen, using the removed tarpaulin. Sitting inside, cooking hot soup by the fire, felt completely different from staying in the tent. Klaus was ready to act. He had been fishing with a rod for 5 to 6 days and was starving. Now, he needed to set up the spike nets. He began pulling the rope gradually, testing the ice along the lake's edge. The ice was deceptively deep and unstable. A careless step could break through. Carefully, he made it to the other side of the lake. After 2.5 hours, he successfully set up the spike nets. The coming days would show if there was a catch. Meanwhile, Anne was ensuring the ice was thick enough to support her fishing. She tested it several times with rocks and felt confident about the ice's strength. Still, Anne decided to wait a few more days to be safe. With nothing else to do, she began playing with stones. On day 39, Ulrich, practicing archery at the entrance, suddenly spotted animal tracks on the ground, undoubtedly a fox, based on the footprints. However, the surrounding prints were complex, making it hard to determine the fox's direction. 2 days earlier, Ulrich had tried attracting the fox with cooked fish soup, but so far he hadn't seen as much as a fox hair. To increase his chances, he poured some fish soup on a tree trunk in the evening, hoping to draw the fox. By day 41, Klaus, checking the spike nets, saw 2 ducks caught in the net from afar. They seemed wrapped by the net and couldn't move their wings. Excited, Klaus quickly waded into the water to retrieve them, fearing they might escape. He bit into them immediately, and with a few snaps of bones, the ducks died instantly. Without hesitation, he sat at the entrance and started processing the duck meat. After plucking the feathers, he discarded the heads and wings, cleaned the innards at the shore, and kept only the plump duck breasts. He roasted them over a high fire for several minutes until the duck was crispy on the outside and tender inside. In less than 2.5 minutes, he had devoured the meat. Over to Anne, she had finished her last base today. If she couldn't find food in the next 2 days, she would consider ending the competition. She carefully went onto the lake, drilled a small hole, and started fishing. Despite the shiny bait, the fish in the area simply wouldn't bite. She waited from morning until the ground she lay on became damp. Realizing the severity, she quickly packed up and returned to the shore. Looking around, the ice had turned deep brown, indicating it might break soon. The next day, as per routine, the show's crew came for a medical checkup. All 3 contestants had lost around 10 pounds, but none were a health threat yet. By day 43, Anne had spent an entire day lying on the lake surface but caught nothing. Feeling it was time to end her participation, she returned to camp and called to withdraw from the game. The crew quickly arrived at her location. As the only female contestant remaining this long, she had done remarkably well. With Anne's departure, only 2 contestants remained. On day 45, Ulrich checked the spike nets under the ice, unsure if he would catch any fish. However, soon after starting to haul, he quickly pulled some fish ashore, catching 3 in total. Meanwhile, Klaus wasn't as fortunate when checking his fish hooks. They were empty. Fortunately, he still had some duck gizzards and hearts left from previous days, and decided to make a simple grilled dinner to get by. On day 47, while making a fire at camp, Ulrich spotted a small squirrel on a distant branch, the first living creature seen in many days. He quickly prepared his bow and arrow, aimed and struck it in one shot, thrilled by his success. He skinned and cooked the squirrel, skewering it on a stick for roasting over the fire. As night fell, he enjoyed his delicious meal. By day 48, Klaus checked his fish hooks again to no avail. Overwhelmed by hunger, he resorted to chewing on icicles. Both contestants spent the entire day outside, trying to relax and determined not to give up at the last minute. On day 49, the crew unexpectedly arrived at the site, initially thought to be for a routine medical check. However, they informed the contestants that due to worsening weather and the roads likely becoming impassable, which could prevent rescue teams from reaching them, the decision was made to declare both contestants as co-champions of the season. They were ecstatic to hear the news and equally shared the prize money. Their families also arrived, making the moment even more rewarding. Congratulations to Ulrich and Klaus for becoming the champions of the season.